Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, I don't want the podcast to be like an entirely New York City focused podcast. But like in our defense, not only do we live here, but you know what happens in New York City? It has problems and it has challenges that are seen really all around the world. So it's not terrible to do a few episodes related to, what's happening around in our neighborhood.
I don't think it's terrible at all. And in fact, one specific area where New York really does have national, maybe even global relevance is in the housing arena, right? So we know New York City has a shortage of housing. People have been trying to come up with ways to improve that, build more supply for a long time, and also lower rents. And so that has, implications for a lot of other cities and places that might also be capacity constrained.
Totally. I mean, like New York is sort of at egregious levels of housing unaffordability, but every city around the world, I think every city that's booming has some challenges of affordability and building more, at least in the West. But I sort of think basically everywhere. And so, people always talk about trying to solve it, et cetera. Anyway, of course, past Odd Lots guest Zohran Mamdani has his proposals for how to address housing affordability, including a rent freeze on a significant chunk of the housing stock in the city. And so we sort of need to get a sense of like what that means and how that, what the implication is for business, whether it could work,
Well, the broader theme here, I guess, is the role of the public sector in the private market, right? Like if we want to get really, really conceptual with this, that's basically what we're talking about. Yeah.
And of course, Mamdani has a slew of proposals and ideas, free buses, faster buses also, his public grocery store trial, et cetera. But, we did that recent episode with Kathy Wild, the head of the Partnership for New York, which represents a lot of major employers in the city. I'm sure they're anxious about him for a number of reasons. But she said within their community, it's really the real estate industry that is the most freaked out, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in this because people talk about the real estate industry as this sort of monolith, but of course it isn't, right? There's residential, there's commercial, there's luxury, there's more affordable. So I want to dig into this a bit more and understand exactly what the concerns are and whether they're coming from different parts of the real estate network.
Yeah, and then there's, even within real estate, there's brokers, and then there's developers who are separate from landlords, et cetera. Anyway, we do have the perfect guest, someone we've had on a few times. Every time New York City real estate is in the news, a guy we like to chat with. We are going to be speaking with Ben Carlos Thypin. He is the founder of a firm called Quantierra, which analyzes real estate. He is also a New York City landlord and broker. Interesting idea.
Is that the most hated demographic in all of New York?
Yes.
Thanks for coming back on the show, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
Kathy Wild, when we talked to her, did say that the real estate industry is the of all of the sectors of the economy the most anxious. What specifically, who's really anxious, or what about Mamdani's sort of vision most sends chills down the spine of landlords or other players in the real estate industry?
Well, I think the reaction to Mamdani is actually not that different from the reaction to Bill de Blasio 8 years ago when he came in, 12 years ago. I think it's been amplified by the political environment we're in, Mamdani's political identity, his race, his ethnicity, and religion. But what scares these people, I think, the most, and when I say these people, I mean the people that are vocalizing their fear, which I think don't necessarily speak for every portion of the real estate industry, as Tracy pointed out. I think what most scares them is that Mamdani's sort of premise of city management does not revolve around them. And this was a major issue during the de Blasio administration that the press covered a lot, where de Blasio, despite appointing some real estate friendly commissioners and generally having a pretty good administration that was pretty good for real estate, he wasn't in the habit of kissing the ring, and sort of showing up to their galas and calling on them and stroking them in a way that, in contrast, Eric Adams, the current mayor, has been very, good at doing. So I think a lot of this is sort of meta feelings about, their place in the city, their influence in City Hall, and depending on the policy, there could be, there's varying degrees of tenuousness to actual policy and market implications.
So who is most scared? Give us some nuance on the vibes.
Sure. So I think the most scared groups are rent-stabilized landlords, because, Mamdani has pledged to freeze rents on rent-stabilized apartments. And then large developers, these sort of, the biggest developers who not only have business models that largely depend on sort of being in a, informal cartel, and having, the best relationships with the people that, make policy in the city and the most powerful players, but also, have a greater sense of civic duty and their role in civic society. And I think Mamdani's rhetoric and some of his policies threaten their sort of sense of their own place within the city.
It's interesting, Tracy. I'm thinking back, we did that not long after we interviewed Mamdani. We interviewed the Jersey City mayor who didn't win his primary nomination for governor. So not everyone who comes on odd lots automatically wins. But one of the things he said that was really interesting is that by he said he talked about depoliticizing.
Yeah.
And that, essentially by making it sort of more streamlined, the process to get approvals, that there are these developers who maybe their edge was that they really knew how to play the game within these boards, within, the community. Suddenly, like, that is a marginal edge that disappears in a system that is much more straightforward. And Mamdani himself, if I'm not mistaken, Ben, has also talked about he does want more development. He's talked about market rate development, and he's also talked about just sort of making that process, if the developer meets certain requirements, labor pay, et cetera, just much more straightforward, which again would seem to speak to your point that perhaps some of the most threatened entities would be those ones who are big and best positioned to sort of play the politics side of the game.
Yeah, I think streamlining does not necessarily benefit the most entrenched incumbents. I think that they wouldn't necessarily fare badly under a Mamdani administration, but they, at least if one takes Mamdani's policy pronouncements at face value, would not be in the driver's seat. The Albanian guy in the Bronx who's building a small multifamily building, he's going to be in a lot more position to benefit from these streamlined policies than, the type of people that are being quoted in the New York Times.
By the way, Tracy, before I forget, Ben talked about the similarities with de Blasio. It's funny because I think there was a quote, we're recording this July 16th. I think I saw a quote yesterday from Kathy Wild in the news that was basically like, Mamdani is like Bill de Blasio, except we like him. Like, he's likable, essentially. But,
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I get it. Okay, so part of this discussion, I understand why developers might be concerned about like losing their competitive advantage when it comes to navigating City Hall and all of that. Are there any concerns beyond initial approval for projects? Is there a concern, for instance, about an emphasis on public housing, perhaps crowding out private development?
I think there's a generalized concern that the Mamdani administration and its vibes are going to depress private investment, whether that's in existing housing or building new private housing. However, even under that scenario, which I don't really agree with and think is kind of a cynical view, there would be beneficiaries of that scenario. So let's say that does happen. Rent-stabilized rents are frozen and private investment in new development and new housing plummets.
They're going to upcharge the market rate.
Exactly. Market rate rents would increase considerably. So under that scenario, the market rate landlords would do very well, and the rent-stabilized landlords who are already not doing well would continue to not do well. And the affordable developers who only build housing with public subsidy, which Mamdani wants to spend considerably more on subsidized housing, would also benefit. So it really speaks to the many different stakeholders within the real estate industry who have different and sometimes conflicting interests.
if demand for residents in New York City broadly is stable or continues to grow as it has been, in this scenario where, in theory, developers just want to pull back, the landlords who have exposure to the market rate units, you'd think they would do very well.
Yeah, and in fact, I have clients who are market rate developers who are out in the market fundraising right now with this argument to say that you should fund this project of ours right now because we're going to be the last buildings to be developed before Mamdani comes in and freezes everything, and therefore we're going to have the best product in the market and be able to charge the highest
pricing power.
That's amazing. So the cost shift is already happening, basically.
Yeah, but again, where people are freaking out, I'm not sure that is necessarily grounded in reality, but I think a lot of the rhetoric, both public and private, we've seen in light of Mamdani's primary victory, is PR and spin. In real estate, everyone's always trying to find an angle to say why their project is best, or why their project should be funded, or why I'm not making this decision, and why I look smart because of that.
Yeah.
So we're still very much in the spin zone.
Let's talk more about that because I feel like one of those cliches, which probably has some truth, is that people who freak out and let themselves get hysterical don't do as well as business as people who adapt to the new environment and sense the opportunities. So you've described one set of people who may be thinking opportunistically right now, which is the people who might have the opportunity to build something before rent freezes come into place. They're going to have the pricing power by this. What else are the opportunities that people sense about, maybe we don't like the policies, but there's a money-making opportunity under the Mamdani administration? Who else is sort of licking their chops, so to speak?
One other group that's licking their chops is the developers that specialize in building affordable housing, which are both for-profit and nonprofit developers. And, they have done pretty well, or they did very well in the de Blasio administration. They've done well during the Adams administration. They consistently do well because, the Mamdani wants to build more government subsidized housing than any previous mayor, but it's not like the developers and the labor for building that housing is just going to materialize out of the government. You're going to be using private sector players to do this. Mm-hmm. So these groups or these players are taking a different approach than some other, pure market rate developers in the real estate industry, and trying to craft sort of a separate piece with the Mamdani administration to say hey, we want to help you meet your goals. We know you want to spend a lot of money. This is good for both of us. And I think another group, ironically, and they're not so much licking their chops because I think they're very scared, is the rent stabilized building owners. Because, as we've discussed on one of our previous podcasts, this is a distressed sector, and it's sort of been heading for a reckoning. And I think Mamdani's policies are going to lead to an acceleration of that trend, so that something gives here. And I think it could give in a sort of cynical way, at the Supreme Court, or it could give in a more optimistic way by sort of Mamdani being something like Nixon to China and going to Albany and crafting some sort of new regime for these buildings that does not burden tenants, but also stabilizes them and make sure that they don't collapse, which is not really in the interest of anyone.
Yeah, this is good context because the long-suffering rent-stabilized building owners have been trying to loosen regulation for a long time, and I think they even sued on a constitutional basis. And clearly the goal is to try to get this to the Supreme Court. But in that context, you mentioned labor really quickly, and I want to go back to that because one of the proposals that Mamdani has is using unionized labor to build all this affordable housing. And I'm curious how feasible that is, what the availability is, and how that actually feeds into costs.
Sure. So when talking about this issue, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not a Mamdani issue. The construction unions all were backing Cuomo. This is really a New York issue writ large. We'll see how Mamdani, unlike most of the other powerful unions, the construction unions still have not abandoned Cuomo. They have not endorsed Mamdani yet. That said, there's obviously organized labor's job is to advocate for the most wages and best benefits for their members. They also need to make sure that their members keep working. So right now we're in a situation with this tax program that was negotiated in two legislative sessions ago, where for particularly large projects, the labor requirements are viewed as too onerous, and no one is building buildings that qualify under this wage standard. So there needs to be some sort of peace that is brokered here, and I think this could be an opportunity, with all the credibility that Mamdani has built on the left, to craft a peace between labor and developers to make it so that we can build housing with unionized labor, but it doesn't break the bank.
It's interesting. You point out, this is something I've been thinking about, but you point out that, for example, most of the unions supported Cuomo. Some of them, such as the construction union, which I hadn't realized, still backing Cuomo. Cuomo also won the endorsement, I think, although they've switched, of the hotel workers union, which I also want to talk about. But it's interesting to me because when people think about a left-wing mayor and how it can go wrong, they reach for the example of Brandon Johnson in Chicago. Brandon Johnson came out of the union machine. I mean, he was part of the teachers union in Chicago. Mamdani, for all his, I'm sure, ideological affinity for organized labor, he doesn't come out of that machine the same way Brandon Johnson, let alone to some extent Cuomo did. So it does feel like there is a potential for some sort of, shifting of the plate, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Yeah. But I think it's hard to argue that that coalition politics and politics generally in New York City have not been scrambled by this event. Yeah. And I think it remains to be seen how all that shakes out, and whether these groups that have been operating in relative concert, perhaps at the expense of other constituencies, remain allied, or whether new alliances are formed to solve some of the city's problems.
How much of this just boils down to wealthier people not liking higher taxes? Because I imagine, if they're trying to get a message out there saying that they don't like taxes, probably doesn't resonate with a lot of New Yorkers, but saying that because of higher taxes or because of all these other policies, there's going to be less development of property, less affordable housing. Is that just them trying to spin it that way?
I think so. And, our media environment is structured as such that there's not really much downside in doing that. So, you hear about, remember a couple of years ago, there was a lot of stories about David Tepper from Appaloosa Capital Management moving to Florida to duck a income tax increase in New Jersey. Yeah. We know there's a media frenzy about this, but no one covered that he moved back. And
I'm always saying this: no one's going to stay in Florida. Give me a break.
And I think the data or an analysis that has been done as this shows that millionaire tax flight actually is largely a myth, and it occurs at a much lower rate than it does for middle and lower income people. And there's all sorts of groups that sort of take advantage of this dynamic. So, for instance, a luxury real estate broker will be, go into the press and say, my phone is ringing off the hook on people that want to sell their apartments here and move to Palm Beach. Does that get them the attention of more people who might be thinking that way? Yeah. But does it reflect market reality, or is anyone, testing to see if that they've been proven wrong? No. And I think, this isn't just a New York City phenomenon. We're seeing a lot of dissonance between people's sort of ideological and policy priors and actual economic analysis. And I think a really good example is a mayor who raised taxes, including on upper earners, several times in New York City, friend of the pod, Michael Bloomberg. And a lot of these same people who are complaining about Zohran think that Bloomberg was their model mayor and really want to go back to the Bloomberg economy. So, people are sort of flailing about looking for any possible way to spin, their own preferences.
Friend of the pod is a...
Yeah.
How are you going to...
Well, I was going to do the standard disclaimer. It has become standard, but Michael Bloomberg is, of course, the owner of Bloomberg LP, which runs Bloomberg Media and Bloomberg News. So there we go. That's the disclaimer.
I like describing him as friend of the pod. But this is a really important point. You're always going to go to Florida. If you go to Florida, you can't be an in-studio guest on the Odd Lots podcast and do all the wonderful things that being in New York City affords you. It really is. I mean, I don't know actually the stats on who leaves New York City, but it's not the rich. I mean, it's people who just find the city unaffordable, right?
Right. And I would encourage everyone to Google Cristobal Young, who's a professor at Cornell who's done a lot of work on this very issue. And something you hear, Kathy Wild mentioned in your interview, and something you hear across business leaders generally, and particularly in commercial real estate rather than multifamily, is the importance of our workforce. Mm-hmm. And if people the talent that fuels New York City cannot afford to live here, that is bad for New York City's economy.
Yeah.
And would lowering the cost of housing be bad for some landlords? Yes, but would it be good for a lot of other sectors of the city, including the office real estate sector?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Similarly with childcare, I don't know anyone who's really opposed to childcare. Like, I think that's a problem for everyone, and it would help employees and employers, but also help real estate owners, because if you remember during the Blasey administration, they rolled out universal pre-K. It's not like there's all this empty space in public buildings near people's houses that you're going to put, childcare facilities. These are going to be rented in private buildings and result in a huge amount of leasing velocity that will often occur in space that is otherwise hard to lease.
When we spoke to Kathy, she did bring up crime. And, initially, maybe you don't make a direct connection between economic policy and crime, but the argument is if there's lots of crime going on in the city, people are going to want to move away, to that New York City flight exodus point. How are landlords or the real estate industry thinking about that particular aspect? Is it important to them? Because that would be maybe a reason to go for someone like an Eric Adams.
Right. I think it's very important to the real estate industry. And a lot of people are scarred by the experience of the 1970s and 80s in New York, even if the contributing factors for New York's issues back then are myriad and complicated. Everyone agrees that having a crime-ridden city is not in the interests of building owners and property values, and really the city at large, given how much of our budget is based on property taxes. And Mamdani has said that he's considering keeping on Jessica Tisch, the current police commissioner, that he's not going to reduce NYPD headcount. I think the real estate industry is very skeptical of this, but the cooler heads within it are sort of keeping in mind that New York City is ultimately a creature of the state. And we have a very moderate governor. We have a more moderate than Mamdani legislature. And the legacy of the New York State Constitution, but also the fiscal crisis in the 1970s, provides Albany with a lot of ways to make sure that the city does not go off the deep end on issues like this.
Can we talk about the last 4 years? I mean, it's a weird 4 years because, you're starting the baseline in 2021, sort of during the worst of the post-pandemic chaos. There's been a decent amount of building, I think. However, it's a really expensive city. There's a reason the affordability line was, I think, so effective in this recent mayoral primary. Like, well, do you have a scorecard for how Mayor Adams did on housing?
I'd give him a C.
Okay.
I think C plus, maybe B minus.
All right, say more.
I think the land use policy.
My children go to one of my children goes to a very progressive school. They don't have grades; they just have this kind of stuff. So you can give the sort of like a qualitative assessment,
feedback.
Yeah. Sure. I think the land use policy was generally pretty good. The City of Yes, which you may have heard of, which is the biggest change to the zoning code in probably 70 years. The income support policy, which a lot of our housing woes are, obviously rents are too damn high and prices are too damn high, but also wages are too damn low. And we need to make sure that people can afford to pay rents. We need to make sure that people can afford to pay the rent that it costs to finance a new building. And the Adams administration has fought sort of the expansion of voucher funding. Where I think it's fallen short on housing is dealing with sort of structural issues with our housing market, particularly the property tax system. And they are not the first administration to fall short on this issue. But I think it speaks to how much Adams's non-housing policies and sort of extracurricular activities have impacted his ability to address structural issues like property taxes.
Can you just explain?
Yeah.
So New York City's property tax system has two sort of major distributional issues. One is that a neighborhood like Park Slope is way undertaxed relative to a poorer neighborhood like Canarsie. So the same two properties paying the same amount of property taxes in those neighborhoods, the property in Crown Heights will be worth 5 times more and is paying the same amount of property taxes as the property in Canarsie. The other distributional issue is multifamily versus single family, or 1 to 3 family. And multifamily and commercial are taxed way more than their relative value contribution to the city's total property tax roll. And this is a longstanding issue. There's been, report after report and commission saying, here's what we should do. And no one has sort of figured out how to go to Albany to craft a new regime that, addresses these issues, which, in addition to producing a lot of discriminatory impacts, are really hampering our housing production and on existing housing operating costs. And I think this is a particularly ripe time to address this issue because of the crisis with a certain segment of the rent-stabilized buildings, because these buildings are way overtaxed. So one could see, in a best-case scenario, the Mamdani administration is, it's instituted its rent freeze. Buildings are starting to have trouble. The Mamdani administration doesn't want to see these buildings. They don't want collapsing buildings. That's not good for tenants. It's not good for their political optics. It's not good for the city's image. So Albany says, all right, we're going to create a new class for these rent stabilized buildings, and it's going to lower their taxes, and that's going to alleviate the burden on these owners from keeping their rents very low.
How much of this sort of existential concern being expressed by the real estate industry goes away if interest rates come down significantly?
I think a lot of it, but it would still be very much there. I think it would become less acute, but would persist because a lot of this is about, these are longstanding conflicts between the real estate industry and between landlords and tenants, between what political faction runs New York, and those cleavages would remain even if interest rates are lower. I think interest rates would bail some people out and increase transaction volume and delay the time at which someone that's in trouble might go bankrupt, but the structural issues would remain.
Can you real quickly just explain the roots of the tax disparity, or why, say, a unit in Brooklyn Heights is relatively undertaxed? Mamdani got into a little bit of trouble because I think somewhere on his website at one point it said something about historically white neighborhoods, and people are like, oh, he wants to tax white people more.
Right.
It happens to be true, however, that a lot of the neighborhoods that benefit from this structure do happen to be more white. But what is the origin of why certain neighborhoods are undertaxed given their sort of their economic base?
Sure. So the current property tax regime was crafted in the early 1980s as a result of a court case, and it instituted caps on the amount that assessments can increase.
Oh, okay.
And
these places have seen their assessments surge
as a result. Yeah. So like Canarsie in 1982 was maybe a comparable income, middle income, lower middle income area that as it is now, whereas Park Slope was a much less well-off area than it is now. And the property values in places like Park Slope and Williamsburg and to some degree a place like Brooklyn Heights have skyrocketed, but the tax burden on those properties have not gone up commensurately.
With your real estate hat on, who's going to win?
Mamdani. I think these efforts to draft another candidate or reboot the Cuomo campaign are totally doomed, and the real estate industry I think is really internally is very split over what to do. And some are going to back Mayor Adams, some are going to back Cuomo, some are trying to craft a peace with Mamdani, and some of them are just going to stay out.
Ben Thypin, thank you so much for coming back on Odd Lots. Always love getting your level-headed perspective on what's happening in our city.
Thank you so much, Ben.
My pleasure.
always really like talking to Ben. I had not realized the sort of, there was a lot there that was interesting. That source of the disparity in property taxes. It makes a lot of sense that if you just can't raise property taxes at a certain clip, how, relatively undertaxed any sort of booming neighborhood such as Williamsburg will inevitably end up being.
Yeah, that seems like a problem given that like a big chunk of the recent story of New York City is gentrification and all these neighborhoods where like a warehouse that used to cost, I don't know, $100,000 in the 80s now costs like 10 million or whatever. The other thing I thought was really interesting, it sort of hammered home that point that we discussed previously, but the idea of the competitive advantage for large landlords basically being they can network in City Hall, they can presumably do the paperwork and all of that stuff. And so if an administration comes in that jeopardizes that particular advantage, then they're not going to like it.
Right. Like maybe the rules for development will be more stringent.
Yeah.
But if they're just sort of uniform where it's like, okay, and I don't know how it could ever be in real estate, but let's just say, in the sort of abstract sense, you check these 4 boxes and you are approved to build a new development, then intuitively, that would sort of undermine the relative advantage enjoyed by a big, powerful entity that sort of knows the system, so to speak.
On the other hand, of course, maybe there are smaller property developers who really like the idea of a streamlined process, doing away with things like the parking requirement and stuff like that, dual staircases versus single. I don't know.
I do think, like, you can't, if you're anxious about what the Mamdani administration is going to bring, you can't really simultaneously argue that it's going to stifle development and rents, right? If development gets stifled, then the market rents go up.
Yeah.
And if, and so there will be this balancing effect. Obviously there are the landlords who are deeply exposed to the rent stabilized market. We've talked about them before, but they're hurting right now as it is. I also do think at some point maybe we should talk about the prospect of a Supreme Court case in the next couple of years that eliminates rent stabilization or rent regulation period. Possibly, you mentioned the sort of cynical possibility of Mamdani being an accelerant that gets that case in front of the Supreme Court at some point could have big implications.
This entire conversation has reminded me that I need to call my super and get something fixed in my apartment. So this was useful.
This is what I miss about being a renter is I don't have someone that I can call as easily. There are some advantages. There are some advantages to being a renter,
All right. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
Actually, I do have a super. I just have to pay him now for it, where it used to be all these various repairs and stuff. The burden fell on my landlord before. Now the burden.
That's not too bad because like the big problem with supers, I feel, is just availability. Or the big problem with getting something fixed is finding someone and getting them in.
Anyway, every time something breaks, I have to pay for it now. They don't tell you that when you become a homeowner.
Pretty sure they do.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guest, Ben Carlos Thypin. He's at SoBendito. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Arman, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cal Brooks at Cal Brooks. For more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots. We have a daily newsletter and all of our episodes. And you can chat about these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you like it when we talk about New York City housing policy, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, you can listen to all of our episodes absolutely ad-free. All you need to do is find the Bloomberg channel on Apple Podcasts and follow the instructions there. Thanks for listening.